Everyone thought that Commander James Bond, one of the best agents in the British Secret Intelligence Service, was dead. A year ago, the head of the Secret Service, who was a man known only by the initial M, had chosen Bond to go to Japan on a highly important mission. His task had been to gather secret information from the Japanese about the Soviet Union. But the job had gone badly wrong, and Bond had become involved in a dangerous battle with a known criminal called Blofeld. It was thought that Bond had killed Blofeld, but no one knew what had happened to Bond himself after the fight. He had simply disappeared. Those who knew him at the Secret Service had now given up any hope that he could still be alive. However, Bond was not dead. He had been captured by the Russians. They had taken him to a secret medical institute in Leningrad, where the KGB began trying to brainwash him. After many months of torture, Bond had grown weaker and weaker, and could take no more. The KGB had finally won their battle to control his mind. A man called Colonel Boris had then spent several more months carefully preparing Bond for his return to England. He had told Bond exactly how to behave, what to wear, and even which hotel to stay in. He had also told him who to contact at the Secret Service headquarters, and precisely how to answer their many questions. James Bond was sitting on his bed in the Ritz Hotel in London, holding the telephone to his ear. There was a moment of silence, and then he heard a man's voice.
"This is Captain Walker speaking. Can I help you?"
Bond spoke slowly and clearly.
"This is Commander James Bond, agent number 007.
Please would you put me through to M, or his secretary, Miss Moneypenny?" Captain Walker was very surprised to hear what sounded like Bond's voice. He quickly pressed 2 buttons on the side of his phone. The first button started a machine which would record the conversation. The second sent a message to the special branch of the police, who would listen to the conversation, trace the call, and immediately arrange for the caller to be followed. Then Walker said,
"I'm afraid I don't know those 2 names. Who exactly are these people?"
"M is Admiral Sir Miles Messervy," James Bond answered calmly. "His office is on the 8th floor. He used to have a secretary called Miss Moneypenny. I want to see him."
"No, I'm sorry," Walker responded apologetically. "I don't know either of them. Can you give me any more information?"
"Well, let's see what else I can tell you then," said Bond, frowning. "It's Wednesday today. That means meat pie will be the main dish on the menu in the canteen." Due to the brainwashing, Bond could not remember all these things himself. He was using the detailed information that Colonel Boris had given him over the last few months. Captain Walker thought for a moment. Could this man really be James Bond? There was always something strange about 007's death. They had never found a body. There was no solid evidence for his death. Perhaps he had escaped alive. Walker decided to send him to the security section of the Secret Service for further questioning.
"I'm afraid I can't help you myself," he told Bond, "but try Major Townsend. His office is at 44 Kensington Cloisters. I'll call and make an appointment for you to see him today."
A short while later, James Bond left his hotel room, stepped out into a cold, clear November morning, and got into a taxi. His every move was now being carefully watched by Special Branch police officers, and a black car followed close behind his taxi.
"I'm here to see Major Townsend," Bond announced when he arrived at Kensington Cloisters. "Yes, he's expecting you, sir," confirmed the man who had opened the door. "Please come in. Shall I take your raincoat?"
The doorman put the coat on a hook near the entrance. As soon as he was inside Major Townsend's office, Bond's raincoat would be taken quickly upstairs to a laboratory. There, someone would test the material to find out where the coat had come from, and if it really belonged to James Bond. And now, as Bond followed the man down a long corridor, a hidden X-ray camera secretly took a picture of Bond and what he was carrying in his pockets. The man knocked on a door, opened it, and asked Bond to go inside. It was a pleasant, very light room, with expensive furniture. A tall man with a friendly face stood up from a comfortable-looking chair, smiled, and walked towards Bond.
"Come in and sit down," he said warmly. "Would you like a cigarette? I'm sorry, these aren't the ones I remember you prefer."
The man watched Bond carefully and noted his reaction. Bond took a cigarette with a blank expression on his face and said nothing. Then both men sat down. Major Townsend crossed his legs comfortably. Bond sat up straight.
"Well now, how can I help you?" inquired Townsend.
Bond looked at Major Townsend. Colonel Boris's description was very good. The big, friendly face, the brown eyes, the military moustache, and the smart suit. But he had not mentioned how very cold and intelligent the eyes were.
"It's really quite simple," Bond explained steadily. "I am who I say I am, and I want to speak to M."
"Yes," replied Townsend, "but you haven't been in contact with us for nearly a year. We all thought you were dead, so you'll understand that we must make sure that you really are 007. Major Townsend asked him several questions, which Bond answered fully and calmly. Then Townsend said, "Now, please tell me where you've come from, and where you've been all these months."
"I'm sorry," Bond apologized, "but I can only tell that to M himself."
"I see," replied Major Townsend. He thought for a few seconds, and then went on.
"Well, I'll make a telephone call and see what I can do. I'll only be a few minutes."
He stood up and picked up a newspaper from a nearby table.
"Would you like to see today's Times?" he asked, and held out the paper.
Bond took it from him. His fingerprints were now on the specially treated newspaper, which would be carefully examined later. Major Townsend went to the next room, closed the door, quickly telephoned the laboratory, and then telephoned Bill Tanner, the Chief of Staff at the Secret Service headquarters.
"Yes, sir," he said a few moments later. "I think it must be 007. He's wearing the same type of clothes he usually wears, although everything looks very new. The laboratory report says that his coat was bought yesterday in London. He answered all the questions correctly, but he's insisting that he'll only talk to M about what's happened. But I don't like it. He has a strange look in his eyes. I apologized for not being able to offer him his favourite type of cigarette, but he didn't know what I was talking about. And the X-ray camera showed that he's carrying a gun, a strange sort of weapon we haven't seen before. Personally, I don't think M should see him alone, although I think that's the only way we'll get him to talk to us. When Major Townsend went back into the other room a few minutes later, Bond was still sitting stiffly in the same chair. He was holding the newspaper, but he had not opened it. Major Townsend smiled. "Well, I've arranged everything," he announced cheerfully. "M is extremely pleased to hear that you are all right, and he'll be free to see you in about half an hour. A car should be here to collect you in about 10 minutes and drive you there." James Bond smiled for the first time, but it was a thin smile, which did not light up his eyes. Chapter 2. The Attack. Bill Tanner, the Chief of Staff at the Secret Service, stood in front of M's desk. "I really don't think you should see him on your own, sir," he repeated firmly. "There's no doubt that it's James. We've matched the fingerprints. But I don't like the feel of this at all. Why has he got new clothes? And why did he check into the Ritz and phone our main reception desk? He could have just phoned me on my personal number, or come straight here to see you. It seems like a typical KGB brainwashing job to me." M looked up at Bill Tanner's tired, worried face and smiled. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but I need to talk to 007 myself. When I sent him to Japan, I had no idea that what should have been a peaceful job was going to end so badly, or that 007 would go missing for a year. He's quite right. It was I who sent him on the mission, and he has every right to report back to me personally. I'll see him. But I want you to wait in the next room and listen in to the conversation. And don't worry about his gun. I can use the new safety device." M pointed up at a thin line on the ceiling. "Are you sure that the glass wall will come down quickly enough when I press the button?" he asked. "Yes, sir," said the Chief of Staff nervously. "We've tested it, and it works all right. But—" A light started to flash on M's intercom. "That must mean Bond is here," said M. "Tell him to come straight in, please." "Yes, sir," Bill Tanner replied. Then he left the room and closed the door behind him. James Bond was standing outside M's office. He was smiling strangely at Miss Moneypenny, who was sitting behind her desk and looking very upset, clearly confused by his odd behaviour. Then he turned and greeted the Chief of Staff flatly. "Hello, Bill." "Hello, James," responded Bill. "Long time no see. M is ready for you now, so let's talk when you come out." "That will be fine," said Bond slowly. Then he went into M's office. Bill walked quickly into the office next to M's and shut the door. He pressed a button on his desk. There was a small click, and then the sound of M's voice came into the room over a loudspeaker. The Chief of Staff listened to what was being said in the next room. "Hello, James. It's wonderful to see you again. Sit down and tell me all about it," said M. James Bond sat down in front of M. Bond knew this chair, and had sat in it and talked to M many times before. Suddenly, lots of different, confused memories came quickly into his head.
Bond tried not to think about them. He knew that he must think only about what he needed to say and do.
"I'm afraid I still can't remember very much, sir," he said. "I was hit on the head while I was doing that job in Japan. I was badly hurt, and I lost my memory. To begin with, I couldn't even remember who or where I was. The Russian police found me some months later in Vladivostok. I've no idea how I got there. The police passed me on to the KGB, and when they checked my fingerprints, they got very excited. For weeks they asked me question after question. I couldn't remember much, but I told them what I could."
"You told them what you could," repeated M slowly. "Was that a good idea?"
"They were very nice to me," Bond replied, "so I wanted to help them. Then I was taken to a hospital in Leningrad. While I was there, specialist brain doctors came to look at my head, and other people came to talk to me about the political situation and that sort of thing. They explained to me how the East and West need to work together for world peace. I hadn't thought about it in that way before, and I think they are right." He looked confidently across the table at M. "However, you probably don't understand. You're always making war against someone, and you've been using me as a weapon to do that for you. But not anymore. That's finished."
"You say the Russians want peace," began M angrily. "Then why do they need the KGB? At the last estimate, the KGB had about 100,000 men and women making war, as you call it, against other countries. And did they tell you that they killed 2 of our agents in Munich last month?"
"Oh, yes, sir," Bond said in a patient voice. "They have to protect themselves from the secret services of the West. But if you close down the British Secret Service, they won't need the KGB."
"I don't believe that for 1 minute," replied M shortly. "Anyway, if the Russians are such good people, then why didn't you stay in their country?"
"We thought that it was more important for me to come back and fight for peace here, sir," explained Bond. M noticed his use of the word we. Just then, Bond's right hand started to move slowly towards the pocket of his coat. M knew now that Bond was planning to kill him. He pushed his chair back from his desk and put his fingers on a button under the left arm of his chair. Bond's face was white, and he looked uncomfortable. He was staring at M, and began to speak in a hard, forceful voice. "We want to remove the people who are responsible for this war," he said, "and you are the first person on the list." Bond pulled his hand out of his coat pocket. He was holding a gun, and was starting to point it towards M. M quickly pressed the button on the arm of his chair. With a loud rush of air, a large sheet of thick, bullet-proof glass dropped down in front of him from the ceiling. At the same moment, brown, liquid poison came from the gun and splashed onto the glass wall that now separated the 2 men. Almost instantly, Bill Tanner and another man came running into the room and threw themselves on James Bond. As they caught him, his head fell forwards, and his eyes closed. "It's cyanide," said Bill. "He must have breathed some of the fumes in. We must all get out of here." The men pulled Bond quickly from the room, and M followed them.
"Don't tell anyone about this," M said to the Chief of Staff a few minutes later. "I'll call Sir James Maloney at the Park Hospital and tell him what has happened.
Take 007 down there. They'll know how to treat him. You heard Bond say what happened to him. He was hurt, and as a result he lost his memory. And then the KGB got him. They brainwashed him. All right, that's all.
Bill Tanner was busy writing everything down in his notebook, but now he looked up.
Don't you want to press any charges, sir? He tried to kill you, he said. Certainly not, answered M. 007 is a sick man, and doesn't know what he's doing. Sir James knows about brainwashing, and will know what to do. If the KGB has the nerve to use one of my best men to attack me, then I have the nerve to send him back to attack them. 007 was a good agent once, and I'm sure he'll be a good agent again. After lunch, please give me the information we have on Scaramanga. When 007 is ready, that will be his next mission. Scaramanga? The shocked Chief of Staff cried. But 007 wouldn't be able to kill him. No one can kill Scaramanga. For what he tried to do here this morning, said M coldly, 007 would have to spend 20 years or more in prison. I don't want that. It would be better for him to die on a mission. It will be a test. If he can kill Scaramanga, then we can forget the past. That's my final decision.
Chapter 3. Scaramanga. When M returned from lunch, he found Miss Moneypenny typing at her desk. "Your office is safe to use again," she informed him, "but keep the windows open for a while. Oh, and here's the file you wanted, sir." M took the brown file from his secretary. It had a red Top Secret star stamped on the top right-hand corner. "How's 007? Did he wake up all right?" he inquired, concerned. "I think so, sir," replied Miss Moneypenny. "The medical officer gave him a sedative, and then he was carried out of the back door under a blanket. No one's asked me any questions about it." "Good," remarked M. He walked through the door into his office and sat down behind the large desk. For the 100th time he assured himself that his decision was the right one. M opened the brown folder and started to read the report. Francisco Scaramanga. Scaramanga is an assassin who works mainly for the KGB in Havana, Cuba, and for other organizations in the Caribbean and Central American states. He is known to be responsible for the death of 5 British secret agents and has seriously injured another. He is well known in the Caribbean and is widely feared by the local people. He always uses a Colt 45 handgun made of gold, and has therefore become known as the man with the golden gun. He uses gold and silver bullets, which are specially designed to cause maximum damage. The police are aware of him, although he has never been arrested. Description: Age, about 35. Height, 1.9 meters. Eyes, light brown. Hair, short red hair with a small moustache. Build, slim, strong, broad shoulders. Personality, ruthless, serious. Enjoys the company of women. Origins. In his early years he lived in Spain and travelled with his father's circus. He learnt to use pistols very skillfully as part of his circus act. His childhood was difficult and painful. Aged 16, he shot a policeman during an incident at the circus. He then hid on a ship and travelled to America. On arrival in the United States, he worked as a gunman for the Spangled Mob in a Las Vegas hotel. His job was to execute people who had cheated at the casino. In 1958 he got into trouble with a rival gang, the Purple Gang, and had to leave the United States. He then became rich by buying and selling property for criminals in the Caribbean. In 1959 he moved to Havana. When Fidel Castro came to power there after the revolution, Scaramanga began working for the Cuban secret police. Conclusion. Scaramanga is a very cold, secretive, paid assassin, with connections to the KGB and the Cuban secret police. A highly experienced and well-trained agent would be needed for this dangerous mission. However, the recommendation is that Scaramanga should be removed as soon as possible. At the end of the report was a handwritten note, which read, "I am in agreement," and below it was the signature of the head of the Caribbean and Central American section. Next to this was the Chief of Staff's signature. M looked up from the paper. For about 5 minutes he sat and gazed across the room. Then he reached for his pen and wrote the word, "Action," and signed the page. He sat very still for another 5 minutes, and wondered whether he had just signed James Bond's death warrant. Chapter 4. To Jamaica. It was a hot, oppressive day when James Bond's flight arrived in Jamaica. Several months had passed since the terrible incident in M's office, and, following Bond's intensive and difficult rehabilitation at the Park Hospital in London, he had been declared fit enough to be sent on a new mission. For 6 weeks now, Bond had been travelling around the Caribbean and Central America, trying to track down his target, Scaramanga. He had apparently missed him by just 1 day in Caracas, but now he had lost the trail. He was waiting in Kingston International Airport for a flight to Havana, as Scaramanga was known to have spent a lot of time in Cuba. It seemed too obvious to search there, but Bond was running out of places to look. Bond wandered around the airport looking at the shops to kill time. As he did so, he walked past a notice board, which held messages for passengers travelling through the airport. He stopped and looked to see if there were any messages under the letter H for Hazard Mark, the false name that he was travelling under. Nothing. He was not surprised. In all his life he had never found a message for him at an airport. But then, as he walked past S, he suddenly froze. He looked around as casually as possible to make sure no one was watching him. Then he covered his hand with his handkerchief and quickly reached out and took an envelope on which was written the word Scaramanga. A few moments later, Bond walked calmly to the nearby men's toilets, and when he was safely inside, he carefully opened the envelope. The message he found read, "To Scaramanga, BOAC passenger from Lima, Peru. From. Message. Message received from Kingston, Jamaica at 12:15. 3.5, Beckford, SLM, from midday tomorrow." Bond could not believe his eyes. At last he had some solid information. Bond read the message again, and then carefully slid the piece of paper back into the envelope and returned it to the notice board. Then he found the British Overseas Airways Corporation desk and checked their flight timetables. Yes, the BOAC flight from Lima to Kingston was due in at 13:15 the next day. Bond thought quickly about what he needed to do. He walked to the Cuban Airlines desk and cancelled his flight reservation to Havana before finding a public telephone and calling the head of the British Secret Service in Jamaica. After a moment, he heard a girl's voice on the line. "Commander Ross's secretary speaking. Can I help you?"
"Could you put me through to Commander Ross, please?" asked Bond. "This is a friend of his from London."
"I'm afraid Commander Ross is away from Jamaica," replied the girl. Bond thought her voice sounded a little familiar. "Is there anything I can do?" she offered brightly.
"Well, my name's—" started Bond.
"Don't tell me," the girl said excitedly. "It's James, isn't it?" Bond laughed. It was his wonderful secretary from the old days in the 00 section.
"Mary Goodnight!" he exclaimed. "What on earth are you doing here?"
"More or less the same job that I used to do for you," she answered warmly. "I was so pleased to hear you were back, but I thought you were ill or something. How wonderful to hear from you. Where are you now?"
"Kingston Airport," said Bond. "Now listen, Mary. I need your help, and quickly. We can talk later. First, do the initials SLM mean anything to you?"
"No, I don't think so," she said slowly. "Oh, I'm not sure, but they could stand for Savannah La Mar. That's a town in the south of the island."
Bond spoke decisively. "Right, I need a car, any car, and a detailed map of Jamaica. Can you bring the car to Morgan's Harbour? I'm going to stay there tonight."
"All right," replied Goodnight. "Anything else?"
"Yes. Wear something pretty, and bring me £100 in Jamaican money so I can buy you dinner," added Bond, smiling broadly to himself. She laughed.
"Well, now I know it's definitely you, James. I'll see you at about 7.
Bond was drinking a bourbon whiskey with ice when Mary Goodnight walked into the little bar on the waterfront later that evening.
"Oh, James," she cried,
and kissed him on the cheek.
"It's so wonderful to have you back."
She was wearing a stylish, orangey-pink dress and a pearl necklace, and James thought that she looked beautiful. "It's good to see you again," Bond told her warmly. "So, tell me the news. Have you managed to get what I asked for?"
She handed him an envelope, saying, "Here's the money, and the car's outside. It's old, but the tank's full of petrol, and it's reliable."
While they ate dinner, Mary Goodnight brought Bond up to date with what was happening in Jamaica.
"There are a lot of problems with the sugar-cane crops," she explained. "Sugar-cane is worth a lot of money to Jamaica. Cuba's sugar crop is Jamaica's main rival, but with the recent hurricane and all the rain they've been having there, the Cuban crop is only going to be about 3 million tons this year. That's less than half of what it should be. So Castro wants to keep the world price high and sell as much Cuban sugar cane to Russia as possible. They say that he's actually paying people to burn the rival Jamaican crops so he can sell the Cuban sugar at a high price. And Savannah La Mar, those initials you were asking me about, that's the area where most of the Jamaican sugarcane crops are grown. Wisco, the West Indian Sugar Company, has a huge sugar-growing estate near there at Frome. The top man of the company, Tony Hugill, is having a lot of problems because his crops keep being burnt." They discussed the political situation in Jamaica for a few minutes, and then Bond asked thoughtfully,
And where's your chief, Commander Ross?
Well, I don't really know, answered Goodnight in a worried tone. He went to Trinidad last week to look for somebody called Scaramanga, a local gunman of some sort. Commander Ross was due back 2 days ago, but he still hasn't turned up. I've informed headquarters, and they've told me to wait for another week.
I much prefer working with his assistant, anyway, remarked Bond, with a smile. Chapter 5. Number 3.5 Beckford Street. The next morning, having studied the map, James Bond got into the old car and began the 200-kilometre drive down to the south coast of the island. It was around midday when he finally arrived in the small, unattractive town of Savannah-la-Mar. He parked the car near the quiet seafront and wandered casually back into the streets of the town. Bond stopped and asked a shop owner if there was a road named Beckford somewhere in the town. He was informed that there was a Beckford Street, and was given directions to it. Bond walked on, and after several wrong turns eventually found number 3.5 Beckford Street. It was a big wooden house, with steps up to the front door, and an old sign that read Dreamland Café. Once the building would have been quite grand, but now it looked tired, and the paint was peeling off. In the front garden there was a large tree, covered in beautiful blue flowers. In the welcoming shade of this tree a young woman was sitting in a rocking chair, reading a magazine. Bond walked up the steps and through the open door into the café. He was looking at the various unappetizing plates of food on the counter when he heard quick footsteps outside. The girl from the garden came in and walked towards the counter. She was pretty, with long black hair and big brown eyes. She greeted him in a friendly voice. "Afternoon." "Good afternoon," replied Bond. "Could I have a bottle of beer, please?"
"Sure."
She walked slowly behind the counter, opened a bottle and passed it to Bond, together with a glass that was almost clean.
"That's 1 shilling and 6pence.
Bond paid for his beer, and then pulled a stool up to the counter and sat down on it.
"Are you just here for the day?"
the girl asked, as she leant on the counter. "Yes, that's right," he replied. "My name's Mark."
"And I'm Tiffy,"
she replied. "Do you own this place?" Bond asked her.
"No,"
said the girl, and laughed.
"I'm just the manager. It might be quiet now, but it's busy in the evenings."
She looked towards a clock on the wall. It was 1:30.
"Oh!"
exclaimed the girl suddenly.
"I've forgotten to feed Joe and May."
She walked over to one of the windows and opened it. At once, from the direction of the large tree, 2 big black birds flew down and through the open window. They flew around the room, and with loud cries landed untidily on the countertop within reach of Bond's hand. Tiffy broke a biscuit into small bits and held them for the birds, who greedily took the pieces from her fingers.
"They're called Jamaican crackers,"
she explained, smiling.
"They're very friendly."
She reached for another biscuit, but then stopped, arms outstretched, and listened. The sound of footsteps came from upstairs, and the smile fell from her face.
"There's a man upstairs who rents a room for meetings. He's an important man, but I don't like him. He's rough, and he doesn't like Joe and May. He says they make too much noise."
She waved her arms, trying to get the birds to fly in the direction of the open window, but they wanted the second biscuit, and refused to move.
Tiffy turned to Bond and begged him urgently, "Please,
Just sit quietly, whatever he says. He likes to make people angry, and then—" Her face was suddenly very serious. At that moment, a door opened behind the counter, and a large man quietly stepped into the room. He came up and leant on the counter, without saying a word. The description of him in the report Bond had been given was exact, but he had not expected the man's shoulders to be so wide, or that there would be no emotion in the small eyes that now examined Bond coldly. He was wearing an expensive-looking suit, a tie, and a gold tie-pin in the shape of a tiny pistol. There could be no doubt. This was Scaramanga. Scaramanga looked towards the birds, then back at Bond, and then said, "I sometimes make them dance. Then I shoot their feet off." "Really?" replied Bond confidently. "That sounds a bit extreme. What do you do it for?" "The last time it was for $5,000. It seems like you don't know who I am. Didn't the girl tell you?" Bond glanced towards Tiffy. She was standing very still, and she looked nervous. "Why should she?" Bond asked, as he moved his hand ever so slightly nearer to the gun which was pushed into his waistband. "Why would I want to know?" Suddenly, there was a flash of gold. "Because of this," replied Scaramanga aggressively, as he pointed his gun at Bond's stomach. "What are you doing here, stranger? We don't usually get tourists here. You're not from the police, are you? Or any of their friends?" A second passed. Then Bond casually crossed his legs and allowed a small smile to appear on his face. He turned to Tiffy and said, "Well, I've no idea who this man is, but ask him what he'd like to drink. Whoever he is, that was a good circus act." Tiffy looked terrified, and did not move. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the two birds, perhaps sensing the tension in the room, cried out and took off towards the open window, like two thieves escaping. The shots from the gold Colt 45 handgun were deafening. The two birds exploded in mid-air, and black feathers flew in all directions. Then there was a moment of awful silence. James Bond did not move. Tiffy grabbed his bottle of beer from the counter and threw it angrily across the room. Then she fell to the floor, crying loudly. Bond picked up his glass and drank what was left of the beer. Then he got slowly to his feet. He walked towards Scaramanga, looked him directly in the eyes, and then walked past him over to where Tiffy was lying. He knelt down beside her and helped her to sit up. He then took a cloth, wetted it at the tap, and gently wiped it over her face.